The houses usually stay standing, the block returns to normal, and the rest of the world just keeps on spinning. Yet, for the devastated relatives and the true crime buffs obsessed with these files, the chilling details simply refuse to die. Domestic massacres are honestly the toughest pills for anyone to swallow. They rip through our ultimate safe spaces, living rooms, holiday dinners, and regular lazy afternoons that suddenly pivot into pure nightmares. That jarring twist is exactly why these bloody tales haunt our nightmares way past the final news cycle. Cops, reporters, and grieving loved ones nationwide blow years of their lives attempting to make sense of this madness. Every so often, the real story finally bubbles up through courtroom drama and hard forensics. In other instances, mysteries linger for dozens of years, keeping investigators on an endless hunt for the truth. Diving into these dark histories reveals one undeniable truth. The devastating ripple effect stretches way past the initial location of the incident. Whole towns can pinpoint the exact moment the chilling news first reached their ears. Folks keep debating these tragedies long after the fact, desperately trying to piece together reality. So now I want your take on things. Out of all the events we explored today, which specific story struck a chord with you, and what made it so unforgettable? Did you gravitate toward the cold trails that eventually cracked, or the baffling riddles that still lack a proper resolution? Drop your theories down below so we can chat about them. I constantly scroll through your feedback, as it is incredibly fascinating to discover what truly captivates my audience. Also, if plunging into intense criminal history is your kind of entertainment, hit that subscribe button immediately. We have a massive lineup of completely obscure, factual thrillers hitting the platform very shortly. I genuinely appreciate you tuning in today, and I will catch you in the upcoming episode. The Great White North constantly earns praise for being an incredibly secure nation to call home, projecting a rather idyllic reputation to the rest of the globe. Folks picture tight-knit neighborhoods, raising kids in peace, and a profound blanket of safety, blanketing everything from bustling metropolises to isolated mountain villages. Occasionally, though, a nightmare unfolds that completely fractures that picture-perfect illusion, leaving a once joyful household echoing with absolute terrifying silence. What was meant to be an unforgettable vacation transforms overnight into a chilling, unresolved enigma. An ordinary Tuesday night watching television spirals into a gruesome bloodbath that will keep detectives scratching their heads for decades to come. The truly disturbing aspect of these tragedies rarely stems from the sheer brutality alone, but rather the deeply unsettling backdrop where they unfold. We are talking about horrific acts occurring in cozy living rooms, at holiday dinners, along sleepy suburban roads, and within the very sanctuaries where victims felt utterly protected. This evening, we are diving deep into several domestic nightmares that rock this northern nation to its core, leaving stunned residents desperately searching for answers. Everyone wondered how such pure evil could infiltrate their peaceful backyards, though justice was eventually served in a handful of these agonizing trials. Other investigations dragged on for an agonizingly long time, while a select few remained shrouded in absolute mystery even today. Before we jump straight into the darkness, I have a quick question for you guys. Exactly which part of the world are you tuning in from, and what does the clock say in your time zone right now? Finding out the global reach of these chilling tales absolutely fascinates me. So if you happen to be a massive fan of thoroughly investigated true crime content, stick around. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because my channel is gearing up to release plenty of mind-blowing mysteries that the mainstream media completely ignored. The Barhaven domestic slaughter in Ontario, 2024. On the evening of March 6th, 2024, desperate first responders sped toward a residence on Berrigan Drive located just outside Ottawa. The clock had barely struck 11 at night when frantic emergency dispatchers began receiving terrifying reports regarding a bloody altercation occurring within that seemingly normal property. Pulling up to the property, authorities uncovered an absolutely macabre bloodbath featuring half a dozen deceased victims indoors, 4 being mere youths. Alongside a critically wounded yet breathing male struggling out on the lawn, it only took a handful of moments for law enforcement to slap handcuffs on 19-year-old Fabio De Zoa. This collegiate scholar from Sri Lanka happened to be rooming under that exact same roof, cementing the nightmare as arguably the most catastrophic mass slaughter the capital city had ever witnessed. Every single casualty belonged to a tight-knit clan of foreign nationals originating from South Asia, who had only recently planted their roots on North American soil. 35-year-old Durrani Danthika Echanayak resided within that suburban household alongside her loving spouse, Danushka Wickremesinghe, and their quartet of beautiful kids. The brood included 7-year-old Inuka Wickremesinghe and his adorable 4-year-old sister, Ashwini Wickremesinghe. Rounding out the youngsters were 3-year-old Renaya and a 2-month-old infant named Kelly, while 40-year-old Gamini American, a mutual friend freshly flown in from overseas, occupied a spare bedroom. Little Kelly had been breathing for a mere 8 weeks, representing a freshly delivered native citizen whose bright future was viciously stolen before it even started. Inuka, her eldest sibling, had just proudly walked through the doors of primary school, experiencing that magical phase where running around the playground and soaking up fresh knowledge felt like the greatest adventure ever. Seeking greener pastures and a rock-solid foundation for their offspring, the Wickremesinghe clan had eagerly relocated to this prosperous Western country. Mirroring the generosity of countless newcomers, they graciously unlocked their front door to accommodate fellow countrymen desperately seeking a fresh start in a completely foreign territory. Fabio de Zuaisa ended up being one of those fortunate house guests after making the massive leap across the globe to pursue a foreign academic degree. He officially registered for classes at Algonquin College and desperately needed an affordable roof over his head to survive the grueling semesters. Welcoming him with open arms, the deeply compassionate family permitted the young man to rent a room inside their peaceful suburban oasis. That incredibly pure gesture of providing shelter to a lonely kid thousands of miles away from his relatives eventually morphed into the absolute most sickening twist of this entire bloodbath. Folks living next door constantly praised the lovely bunch for their polite demeanor, never once suspecting that this warm environment was destined to host a mind-boggling massacre. Everything went to hell on that fateful Wednesday night in early March when unspeakable brutality suddenly exploded right behind those closed front doors. Detectives subsequently revealed that the merciless butcher wielded a massive, bladed instrument to orchestrate the breathtakingly savage rampage. First responders discovered the majority of the butchered bodies scattered indoors, though Danushka bravely engaged the armed lunatic in a desperate bid to shield his loved ones from the slaughter. The frantic scuffle left the protective father with severely mutilated palms and horrific facial lacerations. Forensic specialists noted these defensive slashes were a textbook sign of ferocious hand-to-hand combat, yet the badly bleeding patriarch somehow broke free and bolted out the door. As patrol cruisers screeched to a halt around 11 o'clock that evening, the panicked survivor was standing out on the pavement screaming his lungs out for medical assistance. Heavily armed tactical units instantly breached the threshold, stumbling upon half a dozen lifeless corpses littering the deeply traumatizing crime scene. Cruisers barely had time to put their vehicles in park before deputies spotted the teenage suspect lurking around the perimeter, taking him into custody without a single ounce of resistance. While the forensic squad taped off the perimeter and snapped evidentiary photographs, an undeniable realization washed over everyone that the capital had just endured an unprecedented level of sheer barbarism. By the time the sun came up, local law enforcement held a grim press conference officially verifying the heartbreaking slaughter of a pair of grown-ups alongside 4 innocent youths. News of the atrocity ignited like a blazing wildfire nationwide, sending agonizing shockwaves through quiet neighborhoods sitting thousands of miles away from the initial carnage. Midday on March 7th, 2024, prosecutors officially slapped the accused killer with 6 counts of premeditated homicide and a singular charge of attempted murder regarding the father's brutal maiming. Baffled detectives spent countless hours trying to wrap their heads around what could possibly trigger such an apocalyptic bloodbath inside an utterly unremarkable suburban haven. The department eventually admitted that dispatchers had zero history of domestic disturbances at that specific address prior to the night everything went completely off the rails. Authorities kept digging for answers while the Canadian justice system slowly processed the grim case. Hearings dragged on for several months, with the suspect staying firmly locked behind bars. Everything suddenly shifted when a massive breakthrough occurred in November 2025. Standing before a judge, Fabio De Soa admitted fault to 4 charges of first-degree homicide and 2 of second-degree homicide regarding the Barrhaven massacre. According to the Criminal Code of Canada, anyone found guilty of first-degree homicide faces an unavoidable life sentence behind bars without the chance of early release for 25 years. The judge officially handed down that exact punishment right after he accepted responsibility. This verdict finally closed the books on the trial, even though no legal document could ever reverse the horrific devastation of that evening. In mere moments, the brutal assault robbed Danushka Wikramas of his beloved spouse, his kids, and a dear companion. He managed to live through the nightmare by battling fiercely for his family, yet he would carry that crushing emotional burden forever. Throughout the Ottawa region, the Barrhaven slaughter of March 6, 2024 still stands as one of the most terrifying mysteries to ever strike the local area. It was an absolute disaster rooted in a welcoming household that graciously took in someone desperate, culminating in a heartbreak that neighbors still cannot wrap their heads around. The shocking assassinations of Barry and Honey Sherman in Ontario back in 2017. Early in the day, on December 15th, 2017, a few realtors pulled up to a massive estate at 50 Old Colony Road in North York, Toronto. That lavish residence was owned by Barry Sherman, the unbelievably wealthy creator of the pharmaceutical giant Apotex, alongside his spouse, Honey Sherman, whose place had just hit the market for eager buyers to tour. While walking the spacious interior with an agent representing a potential buyer, one of the brokers wandered down to the lower level to check out a stunning glass-enclosed space overlooking a massive indoor pool. One glance at the scene confirmed a total nightmare, as 2 completely still figures were propped up right beside the railing of the pool deck. Those victims turned out to be 75-year-old Barry Sherman and 70-year-old Honey Sherman. Both were forced into an upright seated posture by the water, strangled with cords, while their coats were yanked backward to trap their arms tightly. First responders rushed to the address right away, and local cops instantly locked down the entire property to preserve evidence. Barry Sherman practically served as the poster child for Canadian corporate success. After being born in Toronto in 1942, he established Apotex, transforming it into a massive global powerhouse for generic medicine production. Throughout several decades, he piled up extraordinary wealth by pushing his enterprise into countless foreign territories. Meanwhile, his wife, born Honey Berman, passionately dedicated her time to heavy charity involvement all across the city. Together, they funneled huge fortunes into medical centers, colleges, and local groups, effectively securing their status as legendary donors. When he ultimately passed away, Barry already had quite the reputation for playing serious hardball in the boardroom. His massive company was tangled up in over 150 ongoing legal battles, mostly facing off against rival drug giants over intricate patent issues. Because of this extensive trail of litigation, detectives were forced to dig through an endless list of business enemies to pinpoint a motive. Upon their initial sweep of the basement area, the authorities were completely baffled by what they found. Both victims sat directly next to each other by the barricade, yet absolutely nothing indicated a violent break-in at the estate. Barely a few days after uncovering the horrific display, cops actually floated the theory that it might have been a tragic murder-suicide. Relatives of the deceased couple vehemently shot down the ridiculous notion that Barry or Honey would ever hurt one another. To fight back, the family brought in top-tier private detectives and forensic experts to thoroughly analyze the clues themselves. Once these professionals reviewed the gruesome site, they confidently determined that the killings were clearly set up to look like something else by an outside party. The highly specific arrangement of the corpses, along with the bizarre way they were tied up, utilizing their own garments to lock their arms in place, struck several analysts as a tactical move straight out of a professional hitman's playbook. Fast forward to January 2018, and the Toronto cops officially walked back their initial theory, declaring it a targeted double murder. Law enforcement immediately shifted gears, poring over mountain-sized stacks of security video ripped from neighboring properties along Old Colony Road. Buried deep within thousands of hours of tape, a single shadowy character caught their eye. Cameras spotted someone strolling down the peaceful block on the night of December 13th, 2017, the exact date cops suspect the crime went down. This mystery suspect seemingly wandered right around the billionaire's property before vanishing into a dark area. It was a section of the upscale subdivision where local camera lenses simply could not catch a decent glimpse of their face. Ever since that discovery, detectives have consistently labeled this creepy, unknown prowler as the infamous walking man. Security cameras captured this figure trudging along the snowy sidewalks, displaying a very unique walking pattern with a prominent limp in their right leg for quite some time now. Top-tier professionals specializing in biomechanics and cutting-edge video enhancement techniques have stepped in, analyzing every frame to figure out who this person is, yet the mysterious wanderer's identity still completely eludes them. While detectives work tirelessly to piece together a chronological sequence of events, they realize the couple was probably murdered on the night of December 13th, 2017, which was a full 2 days prior to anyone finding them. Throughout that window, both victims completely vanished from their daily lives, with Honey skipping a crucial appointment on December 14th and Barry failing to show up at the Apotex headquarters that afternoon, though since they always kept packed and separate itineraries, nobody panicked right away. Friends and colleagues just naturally figured the two of them were tied up with other business matter. Back at the crime scene, forensics teams scoured the mansion for clues to figure out exactly how the perpetrator managed to slip in and out undetected. This horrific tragedy immediately captured the attention of the global press, heavily fueled by Barry's incredibly high-profile corporate background. Taking into account his countless legal battles and a lifetime spent navigating fiercely competitive industry rivalries, detectives were forced to sift through a massive web of professional enemies tied directly to the cutthroat pharmaceutical world. Simultaneously, law enforcement took a hard look at their inner circle, hunting for anyone who knew the layout of their house or tracked their daily habits. In the ensuing years, authorities interrogated countless witnesses while combing through mountains of bank statements, private text messages, and every single piece of CCTV footage they could find. Yet despite this monumental effort, no one has ever been placed in handcuffs. The surviving relatives absolutely refused to let this go, fighting relentlessly to uncover the truth behind what happened. Hoping to finally loosen someone's lips, the family put up a staggering 35 million Canadian dollars for any tip that puts the killer behind bars. To this day, that massive bounty holds the record as the single biggest private cash incentive ever floated in the country's history. Almost 10 years down the line, this brutal double homicide stands as one of the most baffling mysteries the nation has ever seen. That blurry phantom caught on the security cameras remains the sole individual the police have ever publicly named as a suspect. The grim reality of what unfolded inside that lavish indoor pool at 50 Old Colony Road on December 13th, 2017 still haunts the detectives. Exactly who slaughtered this billionaire couple and for what reason remains a mystery, which brings us to another chilling case, the 1982 Wells Gray Park murders in British Columbia. Back on September 13th, 1982, a local forager was hunting for wild mushrooms on an isolated mountain trail near Wells Gray Provincial Park when something bizarre caught his eye. Tucked away from the main dirt path sat the completely charred remains of an automobile. The flames had totally decimated the car, leaving behind nothing more than a scorched pile of twisted metal. Once law enforcement finally arrived to inspect the grim scene, it became painfully clear that this wasn't just some junker dumped in the woods. The wreck was identified as a 1981 Ford Ranchero, and inside the ash lay severely burnt human corpses connected to a family who vanished over 30 days ago. The deceased were identified as 60-year-old Bob Bentley and his 59-year-old wife, Edith. They had hit the road for a warm weather wilderness adventure alongside their daughter Jackie, her husband George, and the couple's teenage girls, 13-year-old Janet and 11-year-old Karen, the whole group having departed from their Port Coquitlam residence together. That early August in 1982 was meant to be a peaceful, restorative vacation touring through the stunning landscapes of British Columbia. Just like countless other locals, their itinerary was packed with pitching tents, casting fishing lines, and taking in the great outdoors. When the entire group missed their scheduled arrival back to civilization, loved ones immediately contacted the authorities, though initially hoping they had just decided to stay out in the woods a little longer. the radio silence soon became truly terrifying. Massive rescue operations were soon mobilized, sweeping through vast stretches of the provincial reserve and its rugged borders. This specific region is an absolutely enormous stretch of untamed nature, packed with confusing timber trails, thick foliage, and completely isolated bodies of water, which made navigating the brutal terrain nearly impossible until the charred Ford Ranchero popped up weeks later and gave detectives a solid starting point. The blaze had destroyed the bodies so thoroughly that medical examiners actually struggled to figure out who was in the car at first. Through rigorous forensic analysis, the homicide team was ultimately able to piece the puzzle together, definitively proving that the cremated victims were the older couple, Bob and Edith, along with the younger parents, Jackie and George. Because the two young girls were missing from the wreckage, a fleeting glimmer of optimism sparked that they might have somehow survived out in the wild. Rescue crews instantly doubled down on their grid searches, fanning out in every direction from where the torch vehicle was dumped. Sadly, that desperate wish was completely crushed when the children's bodies were uncovered in the woods, just a short distance from the crime scene. Finding those final victims tragically cemented the fact that this entire innocent family had been viciously wiped out. Detectives immediately concluded that the inferno was nothing more than a desperate, calculated move by the killer to destroy all the evidence. Detectives discovered that the perpetrator loaded the four grown victims into the car, steered it toward an isolated alpine trail, and intentionally torched the entire thing. The terrifying events leading up to that fiery scene unfolded at a secluded campground tucked away within the dense woods of Wells Gray Provincial Park. Detectives quickly zeroed in on a suspect named David William Shearing, a 24-year-old drifter who practically called the surrounding provincial park his home. This particular local had a reputation for isolating himself in the backcountry for extended stretches, which gave him an intimate knowledge of the most hidden stretches of the wilderness. Subsequent clues painted a disturbing picture, showing that the culprit actively stalked the Bentley and Johnson clan long before he finally made his deadly move. Lurking quietly among the dense timber, he kept a watchful eye over their seemingly peaceful vacation setup. The stalker carefully memorized their daily routines while patiently biding his time, all while the unsuspecting relatives simply tried to enjoy their relaxing getaway. They spent those blissful days grilling food, sharing stories by the crackling flames, and soaking in the natural beauty, completely oblivious to the predator hiding just past the brush. Sometime during the first few days of August 1982, the heavily armed prowler crept right into the heart of their camp carrying a loaded firearm. His initial victims were the four older relatives, ruthlessly gunning down Bob and Edith Bentley as well as Jackie and George Johnson. Law enforcement ultimately determined that this entire massacre was driven by a dark desire to kidnap the couple's two little daughters. Once the parents and grandparents were dead, the assailant dragged Janet and Karen Johnson deep into the bush, where he held them hostage in the rugged terrain for almost a week. Tragically, he eventually took their young lives too, leaving seasoned detectives absolutely horrified by both the sheer viciousness and the chilling level of premeditation. The murderer heavily relied on the vast isolation of the backcountry to conceal his horrific deeds. He meticulously transported the corpses and incinerated the automobile, hoping to destroy any forensic clues, which left authorities completely stumped even after locating the charred wreckage. The mystery lingered without any answers for several months. And almost 12 full months drifted by following the discovery of the ruined Ford Ranchero before anyone was placed in handcuffs. Throughout that frustrating waiting period, detectives chased down thousands of leads while questioning countless tourists who visited the provincial park during the summer of 1982. A massive turning point finally arrived thanks to a highly unconventional piece of police work. Law enforcement initiated a massive trace on every single Ford Ranchero registered throughout the region, painstakingly sifting through files tied to thousands of different drivers. This grueling strategy successfully whittled down the suspect list until the authorities finally slapped cuffs on David William Shearing on November 23, 1983. Catching the killer marked the culmination of a massive, exhausting search that easily ranked as one of the most sprawling manhunts ever conducted in British Columbia. Standing before a judge in 1984, The accused openly confessed to 6 separate charges of premeditated murder regarding the slaughter of Bob and Edith Bentley. He also admitted to killing Jackie, George, Janet, and Karen Johnson, which resulted in an automatic life sentence behind bars without a chance of release for 25 years under the country's penal code. During his incarceration, the disgraced man legally swapped his given name to David Annis. This terrifying nightmare still manages to claw its way back into the public eye every single time a potential early release hearing pops up on the calendar. The review board took a hard look at his requests for freedom in both 2021 and 2024, ultimately slamming the door shut on him both times. Relatives of the deceased and deeply disturbed locals from across the province have continuously raised their voices in protest at these legal proceedings. They passionately argue that the sheer magnitude and horrifying brutality of his actions mean he should absolutely rot in a cell forever. Over 40 years have passed since the bloodshed, yet the 1982 Park Massacre still stands tall as an exceptionally gruesome chapter in the nation's true crime history. What was supposed to be a joyful, multi-generational summer retreat transformed into a bloodbath out in the middle of nowhere. It serves as a haunting warning that the most serene, breathtaking landscapes on Earth can instantly warp into the staging ground for pure evil. Moving on to the horrific Douglas Garland saga from 2014. Law enforcement descended upon an isolated plot of land just north of Airdrie on the morning of July 4th to apprehend their primary suspect. This 54-year-old loner resided on a deeply hidden acreage alongside his aging mother and father, and his capture capped off a frantic, multi-day search for 3 missing Calgary residents. Crime scene techs systematically combed through the sprawling estate, meticulously inspecting every single truck, outbuilding, and piece of machinery they could find on the acreage. The gruesome clues they slowly unearthed across the dirty landscape would ultimately solve the terrifying mystery surrounding Alvin Lickness. It also revealed the grim destiny of his wife Catherine and their precious 5-year-old grandson Nathan O'Brien, all of whom had practically vanished into thin air from a peaceful suburban house. This entire nightmare kicked off on June 30th, 2014, right in the heart of an upscale community called Park Hill. Early that day, the little boy's mom pulled up to her parents' residence, fully expecting to bring her kid back home after a fun evening with his grandparents. The youngster absolutely loved doing weekend sleepovers there during summer break, but the second his mother stepped through the front door, her stomach dropped. She found the entryway completely unsecured, and a quick glance around the interior revealed obvious, terrifying indicators of a massive physical brawl. Couches and tables were tossed around like rag dolls, while bright red stains painted a horrific picture across multiple rooms in the usually tidy dwelling. Despite the chaotic mess, the house was completely empty. Prompting terrified relatives to dial 911 while arriving officers immediately locked everything down as a major crime scene. Given the fact that a vulnerable little kid was completely unaccounted for, the stakes were incredibly high. Officials swiftly blasted out an Amber Alert for 5-year-old Nathan, praying that a random bystander had spotted the victims or their car, which caused the tragedy to explode into headlines across the entire country. Swarms of concerned citizens teamed up with local cops to scour the neighborhood, leaving forensics experts to piece together the blood-soaked puzzle left behind in the living room. 66-year-old Alvin Lickness made a lucrative career for himself after spending several decades climbing the ranks in the petroleum industry. His 53-year-old wife, Catherine, built a beautiful reputation within their community as an incredibly loving mother and fiercely dedicated grandmother. The most tragic casualty was little Nathan, a sweet young boy who was just staying over at his grandparents' house right before everything went horribly wrong. While combing through the residence, law enforcement uncovered terrifying clues indicating that the targets were violently abducted following an initial struggle indoors. As the manhunt intensified, authorities started closely scrutinizing various former associates and professional contacts linked to Alvin's corporate ventures. It did not take long for one particular individual to stand out as a prime suspect, a man named Douglas Garland. Way back in the day, this guy helped engineer specialized machinery for drilling operations, most notably a device commonly known in the trade as a C-pump. Garland carried a massive grudge utterly convinced that Alvin stole the glory for that invention and unfairly pocketed millions of dollars in licensing fees that rightfully belonged to him. Detectives eventually figured out that the disgruntled inventor wasted years obsessing over this perceived betrayal, letting a toxic hatred for the businessman completely consume his mind. Once cyber technicians managed to crack into the suspect's personal desktop computer, the horrific truth came out. They stumbled upon a chilling digital trail featuring surveillance pictures of the victims, accompanied by meticulous logs detailing the layout of their property and daily schedules. While cops mapped out the sequence of events, security footage from the Park Hill neighborhood caught a suspicious truck creeping around the residence right when the abduction took place. Law enforcement officers worked tirelessly until they definitively tied that exact getaway truck back to Garland. On the 4th of July, 2014, tactical teams slapped cuffs on the suspect and launched a massive raid across his sprawling farm situated just outside of Airdrie. The most mind-blowing break in the case actually dropped out of the sky when a commercial surveying plane happened to snap routine topographical shots directly above the acreage. Those incredibly sharp aerial photographs caught a lot of deeply disturbing movements on the land, which forensic experts later analyzed under intense scrutiny. Zooming in on the drone-like captures, agents identified what looked exactly like two grown adults sprawled face down in the dirt, alongside a much smaller silhouette. Those visual records heavily implied that the abducted family members had already been forcibly transported to the remote acreage at that exact moment. Those snapshots from the sky turned into one of the most uniquely chilling components of the entire prosecution strategy. They offered an insanely rare, real-time, bird's-eye view into the absolute horrors unfolding out in the fields immediately following the kidnapping. While crime scene technicians relentlessly scoured every single inch of the rural compound, they hit a truly sinister discovery. The team zeroed in on a massive industrial-grade disposal tank used for burning waste, where they ultimately sifted out over 80,000 shattered bone fragments and charred bits of human teeth. Advanced genetic profiling at the crime lab eventually proved without a doubt that those grim remains belonged to Alvin, his wife, and their beloved grandson. Even though the killer nearly obliterated the corpses entirely, the DNA evidence painted an undeniable picture showing the trio was mercilessly executed after being dragged out of their Calgary house. The highly anticipated courtroom showdown kicked off in 2017, with state attorneys laying out mountains of undeniable scientific data in front of the judge. They also brought out the incredibly damning digital breadcrumbs pulled straight from the murderer's hard drive. To seal the deal, lawyers played the neighborhood security clips and displayed those hauntingly crystal clear plain photographs for the entire jury to see. Taking all of that rock-solid proof into consideration, the panel of peers swiftly convicted the sick individual on 3 separate charges of premeditated homicide. When handing down the final punishment in February of 2017, the magistrate slapped the monster with a consecutive life sentence, effectively locking him in a cage for 75 agonizing years. That massive penalty truly mirrored the sheer brutality of wiping out 3 innocent souls, cementing this vicious slaughter as an unforgettable nightmare. Losing sweet little Nathan and his doting grandparents like that continues to stand as one of the darkest, most stomach-churning tragedies Western Canada has ever witnessed. A totally innocent weekend staycation at Grandma's house violently morphed into a devastating tragedy fueled by decades of unchecked jealousy and psychotic fixation. Bringing this monster to justice demanded top-tier cyber sleuthing, cutting-edge science, and a totally miraculous snapshot from the heavens just to crack the puzzle wide open. The horrific slaughter of the Gakal bloodline sent shockwaves straight through British Columbia back in 1996. Right around sunset on Good Friday, April 5th, 1996, desperate 911 calls regarding heavy artillery blasts sent Vernon City cops racing toward a quiet house nestled on Okanagan Avenue. Stepping through the front door, first responders immediately collided with an apocalyptic nightmare of unimaginable proportions. An absolutely beautiful pre-wedding celebration meant to ring in a marriage the very next morning had devolved into a blood-soaked execution for nearly the entire household. Once paramedics finally stopped sweeping through the bullet-riddled floor plan, they counted 8 lifeless bodies scattered across the rooms. A ninth person clinging onto a shred of life was rushed to the emergency room, but tragically succumbed to those catastrophic wounds shortly after arriving. The deranged gunman behind the carnage, a 26-year-old named Mark V. J. Chahal, was nowhere to be found when the sirens pulled up. Investigators quickly tracked the shooter's escape route straight across city limits to a cheap lodge, only to discover he had already taken his own life in the dark. The tight-knit Gakal clan was incredibly beloved and highly respected within the local Sikh neighborhood of Vernon. Dozens of joyous relatives were happily packed into the living room honoring the Mayan, a beautiful cultural tradition designed to kick off the matrimonial festivities. This sacred ritual was specifically intended to shower the blushing bride-to-be with endless luck as she crossed the threshold into total marital bliss. The shining star of that horrific night was stunning 24-year-old Balwinder Kaur Gakal, who was supposed to be walking down the aisle a mere 12 hours later. Her 26-year-old sister, Rajwar Kaur Gakal, was also there to celebrate. She used to be married to Mark V.J. Chahal, but their marriage had fallen completely apart. During the months before April 1996, she finally left him and moved right back into her parents' house in Vernon. Detectives noted that she actually reached out to the police multiple times prior to the massacre, terrified because Chahal was stalking her, which brought a dark cloud of anxiety over the whole household. Yet nobody could have predicted that his bitter grudge would erupt into the absolute bloodbath that happened that fateful night. Extended relatives were bustling all around the property, busy getting everything ready for the upcoming nuptials. The family patriarch, Karnail Singh Gakal, happened to be out by the driveway scrubbing down one of their vehicles. Later that evening, Chahal suddenly showed up uninvited at their front door. He came packed with serious firepower, carrying both a .40 caliber Glock and a 9mm Smith & Wesson handgun. The very first person crossing his path was the father, who was still out in the yard. The gunman executed him right on the pavement before making a beeline straight for the front door. Inside, the vibrant Mayan pre-wedding festivities were still in full swing. Guests mingled in the living room and hurried down the hallways, excitedly setting things up for tomorrow's big event. The shooter forced his way inside and started stalking through the residence. He went room to room in a terrifying rampage. Detectives later called it a highly calculated slaughter, taking out every adult relative he could find. One of those fatally wounded was his own estranged wife, Rajwar. He also mercilessly gunned down Balwinder Kaur Gakal, the beautiful bride-to-be who was supposed to walk down the aisle the very next morning. When the terrifying gunfire finally stopped, 8 innocent people lay dead on the floor. A ninth relative, Roger Saran, sustained life-threatening gunshot wounds during the chaos. Medics rushed him to the emergency room, but he sadly passed away, pushing the heartbreaking death toll up to 9. Miraculously, a single young child made it out alive. Little 6-year-old Justine Saran took bullets to both of her legs while hiding in the home. Against all odds, she pulled through and was immediately hospitalized for her severe wounds. Frantic 911 calls from panicked neighbors and fleeing guests sent waves of cops and ambulances rushing to the suburban street. While law enforcement locked down the bloody crime scene and started the grim task of naming the deceased, they quickly figured out the killer had vanished into thin air. A few short hours later, heavily armed units tracked him down to a local spot called the Globe Motel. Cops breached his rented room only to find his lifeless corpse. He had cowardly turned his weapon on himself right after the slaughter. Detectives stumbled upon a suspicious briefcase on the bed, later labeling it his personal death kit. It held a twisted stack of paperwork, featuring a chilling, handwritten hit list of everyone he planned to murder. Alongside his last will and testament was an angry suicide letter whining about how his ex-wife's family had supposedly disrespected him. Since the monster took his own life, a judge would never get to sentence him. Police had to dig through the evidence themselves just to piece together his deadly timeline. Law enforcement discovered he drove into town already packing heat, and he even polished his aim at a nearby shooting range just hours before the ambush. Back inside that devastated house on Okanagan Avenue, crime scene techs kept tripping over bittersweet reminders of the joyous party that originally brought the family together. The most heartbreaking sight was the bride's stunning, unworn gown, simply waiting for a magical morning that would never arrive. Rather than throwing rice and cheering for newlyweds, this shattered town was forced to organize a mass burial. This unimaginable horror permanently scarred Vernon, a sleepy little city completely unused to this kind of absolute brutality. The local Sikh community quickly rallied to host beautiful vigils and heartfelt prayer circles for the fallen victims, while everyday citizens from all over the valley packed out public memorials to show their support. Decades later, this nightmare remains a massive talking point across the country, not just because of the insane body count, but people stay mad over the fact that his ex-wife practically begged the cops for help beforehand. As for the brave 6-year-old girl who made it out of that living hell, this horrific night completely shaped her future. Growing up, she boldly shared her survival story and became a fierce advocate for families impacted by domestic abuse. A beautiful evening meant for honoring old marriage traditions rapidly devolved into a historic bloodbath that claimed 9 innocent souls, leaving an entire neighborhood permanently haunted by the senseless bloodshed unleashed inside those 4 walls. Horrific sagas like this one always leave deep, ugly scars on the towns that have to endure them.
First responders walked into scenes that defied comprehension. Entire family lines gone, small children among the victims, and communities left searching for answers. The hardest question was not who did it, but how it was allowed to happen, and whether earlier intervention could have changed everything that followed. Safety is not guaranteed by location alone. It is built through awareness, honest conversation, and the courage to act before tragedy forces your hand. Know your neighbors by name. The genuine relationship with the people around you is one of the most powerful early warning systems any community can have. If someone shares fears about a partner or housemate, do not minimize it. Help them document incidents, identify trusted contacts, and access crisis resources without delay. Learn the warning signs of escalating danger: isolation from loved ones, controlling behavior, verbal threats, and sudden changes in mood or patterns of access. Support local domestic violence shelters, crisis hotlines, and legal aid centers. These organizations depend on community awareness and consistent funding to operate effectively. Advocate for stronger community safety policies. Attend public meetings. Ask your representatives about early intervention programs, and vote based on public safety commitments. Raise children who feel safe speaking up. Normalize conversations about boundaries, danger, and the importance of telling a trusted adult when something does not feel right. If you notice obsessive or threatening behavior in someone dealing with a personal dispute, take it seriously and gently encourage them to seek professional support before it escalates. Every name lost in these stories represents a life full of promise, laughter, and belonging. They deserved every tomorrow that was taken from them far too soon. Choose to be the neighbor who notices, the friend who listens, and the community member who acts. That is how we honor the lost and protect the living. Families across Canada trusted that their quiet streets and welcoming communities would keep them safe. For some, that trust became their final tragedy. This lesson draws from 4 real cases: Barrhaven 2024, the Sherman murders 2017, Wells Gray Park 1982, and the Gack family massacre in Vernon 1996. In Barrhaven, the Wickramassi family opened their suburban home to a foreign student they believed needed help. There were no prior incidents, no complaints, no reason to fear. In Toronto, Barry and Honey Sherman, generous philanthropists known across the country, were found murdered in their own home. No arrest has ever been made. In Wells Gray Park, a family of 6 left Port Coquitlam for a summer camping trip. A local drifter who knew the wilderness had been watching their campsite for days. In Vernon, Rajwar Gakhal had contacted police multiple times about her ex-husband before that Good Friday evening when he arrived at a family wedding celebration armed with 2 handguns. In each case, the system had information. Neighbors had observations. Family members had concerns. Yet the gap between awareness and action proved fatal. Violence arrived not in dark alleys, but inside living rooms, at a poolside, deep in a forest, and at a gathering meant to celebrate love and new beginnings.